why is that important? Well, I think the answer is, in my view, my gray hair, being a senior faculty, is that the success of science fundamentally revolves around community. That great science is done in great communities. And you know, I think it's very natural, something very human. I think human beings want to feel like they belong to something. It's that their work is not just a job that they're doing, that they want to feel part of something, a community of interacting individuals. You know, they want to be inspired, they want to be in a great environment, they want to be in an environment that's compassionate. They also, you know, have to realize that science now does require communities because science is too difficult to do it alone, that you need to interact with other people to do great science. And, you know, and I think one of the challenges for India, quite frankly, is not just the money. It's about creating a culture of science. And that cannot really be underemphasized. And if you think about your community, I think you can think about it at many different levels. So first of all, each of you in the audience right now has to create a community in your own lab. And that's one of the things also you hopefully learn from the YIM meeting, and learn some tools about how to do that well. And you've probably seen various labs that have been very successful at that, and other labs that haven't been. And a lot of that is the choices that you make about how you treat people, how you create interactions within your group, how you inspire people within your group. If you are going to succeed as an individual, you have to create that community within your own group, no matter how big or small, even if it's just a couple people. Second of all, your department is a community. And you have to start thinking about that larger group as well. Again, and also as individuals, what can you do to make that community better? Your institute is a community. You know, that there should be some sense that you are all in that institute together and somehow working for the common good. And as I'll get onto in a second, India is a community. It has to think like a community if it's going to succeed. And I'll mention a few reasons why I think that's important. But the main thing is that community generation does not just happen. It's not the default. And if a great community is going to happen, energy has to be put into the system. And who's going to put that energy in? It has to be you. Or it has to be people in this room. It has to be everyone that has come through a YIM meeting. You are the ATP that is going into the system to create all of these communities that I just described. And there has to be some general sense, although life is hard for everyone, running a lab, lots of worries, but there has to be some sense that of raising all the boats together. Not just your lab or yourself, but raising the boats of the labs around you, raising the boats of all the labs in India. That has to be part of the mentality that you bring to the problem. Someone, like, you mentioned at one YIM that some elements of Indian science are like crabs in a bucket, that one tries to get to the top, the other ones pull it down. And I think that is just a fundamentally wrong attitude. And I think that's just an attitude that has to change. That the way all of you are going to succeed is not just by you succeeding, but by your neighbors succeeding, by your friends at other institutes succeeding. That is the new India, the new attitude that just has to evolve from that other metaphor that I just mentioned. That's an old metaphor, and I think one should just leave that at the door of history and not going forward. So maybe just in the last few minutes, and I wrote a blog on this, which just got posted, I think, today on India Bioscience. But I think one of the things that we're trying to do in this meeting is also take a bigger challenge than our traditional yin meetings. And all of you now are junior, mid-career investigators. And I think the future of what India will look like in terms of its life sciences has to be a conversation with this group and the senior leadership to really think through these issues, in a very thoughtful way. And hopefully that will be the spirit of this meeting. Hopefully there will be white papers that will come out of it. But I thought I'd just raise a few issues myself. Also from kind of my perspective of seeing India and also being very familiar with the US. And for the issues that I'm raising, I don't really think I have solutions to what I'm going to say, but I think there are at least questions that deserve being asked. And I think globally at one level also, I think India as a developing country, of course, many of you trained in the US and bring some kind of, concept of how one thinks should be that back to India. So I think there's naturally been a tendency to look to the US as a model that one should follow. And in many ways, I think that's quite good, but I think one should also challenge that notion in some cases and not follow that blindly. Because, in some cases, I think India could potentially be more progressive than what's happening in the United States. And also, following exactly what the US is doing does not necessarily translate to good solutions for India. And so at some point, one may want to be selective in what one chooses to adopt, and also in other cases say, well, that's not quite right. I think India should take a new path. And it shouldn't be afraid to also take those pioneering steps where it's actually doing something that is different from the traditions in the United States. I think some of the reasons are that time to tenure is short. It takes more work to produce a publication. And therefore, you want to work on something that you're pretty sure you know how to do so that you can, get some success to the publication and tenure. And also that grant committees also tend to want to see established track records or preliminary results in some particular area. I think the India-specific problem, though, is more this, that students and postdocs traditionally have been exported, if you'd like, and I am leaving out Europe because I'm just speaking from my own knowledge in the United States right now. But I realize they go to Europe as well, but I think some of the same issues exist. But traditionally, there's been, kind of a brain drain at the training level to go to the United States. And obviously then, this plants the seeds for what these trainees do because they're working in U.S. labs, they're working on tend to be working more in areas that are U.S. well-funded research areas. So their postdocs may be in that. They may be working on this, on motor proteins in my lab, or membrane trafficking in another lab, or Drosophila development in another lab. And then, those are the credentials that they come back to India with to start their own laboratory. And, in many cases then, they start that laboratory in the subject area that was really seated in the United States and not in India. So the problems with this paradigm, however, is that sometimes that puts, all of you in areas that are highly competitive because they are, if you went to a big lab in the United States, that is likely to be a fairly competitive area in the US. I think the biggest problem, though, is oftentimes you bring this project back to India and you had a big critical mass in the United States, either of resources, of colleagues who are working in the same area, and suddenly you're in this institute, which is a small institute, and diluted. There's no one, all of that resources that one had in the United States may not be present in that local environment, both in terms of actual resources, but also just the intellect of, other people sharing that same research area. So I don't really have the solution to this, but I think it would be interesting for India to think about ways in which Indian scientists, even if they trained abroad, that the barrier could be lowered for them to get into areas that may be actually much more relevant for Indian research, and as I said, also understudied in the West. It could be both a niche for India and also the niche for an investigator. So again, I don't have a perfect solution for that, but I think if India wants to do this, if they want to really expand research areas in subject areas that are kind of more India specific, they may want to think of opportunities for retraining faculty, like the opportunity to take a short sabbatical so one can retrain in an area, or opportunities for students to go to another lab to retrain in a particular area. And also maybe thinking of ways in which there could be at least greater emphasis and really planning on building India-wide collaborative networks, for example, in malaria or tuberculosis or biodiversity, that really start to not, again, think of individual labs, but think of India almost as one big collaborative lab where if that collaborative network was formally established, it would also operate with principles behind it, that there would be data sharing between those labs, that there would be reagent sharing between the labs, that there would be training opportunities that collaborative network would organize. And that's a way in which the existing scientists in that particular field could also welcome newcomers who want to make the transition to that field, and therefore have the barrier for entry reduced to encourage new people within India to be almost kind of welcomed to that field in a way that smooths their transition to work in that area. So another area in which I think, again, India could think more of itself as one institute rather than a whole bunch of separate institutes is access to leading technologies. Of course, we know that the current state of biology is very expensive. A lot of the research that is being done requires access to a lot of sophisticated instrumentation. And what I'm seeing right now in the United States is it's almost starting to be a division of the haves and have-nots, even within the university system in the United States. So some universities, like mine, UCSF or Stanford or et cetera, their goal is really to be self-sufficient in everything that I'm showing you here. To have access at your institution all of the latest technologies that you see here and more. But the problem is, as I think one appreciates, this is just not a viable solution in India. For every institute and every university to have, that suite of technologies. So if that's the case, India may have to be smarter, I would say, than the United States, and more strategic than this every institute is a boat onto its own, that needs to float with all these technologies. I think, India's solution, again, may be thinking of India as one institute where, the goal is to amass all of that technology that is present and ever changing every year, but really to concentrate that into regional centers or national centers and really I know this is being done to some extent, but probably not at the level at which it could be in India. And there is a National Center for Cryo-EM right now at INSTEM. I think that's an example of something that it may make more sense to pool all the resources for cryo-EM in one institute. But in other cases, mass spec, gene sequencing, it may be reasonable to start thinking about regional centers and making them broadly accessible to many institutes and universities who can use them. The other reason why this is maybe worth thinking about is not just the cost of instrumentation, it's the cost or the opportunity of talent. All of these instruments require really talented technology developers to run these facilities, to train people, to really even develop technologies themselves. The US has a terrible model for promoting these kinds of individuals that are technology developers. There's no career track for them. So India could do better. It could really think about career track structures for technology developers, being ahead of the US in this game, and really investing the effort to focus the recruitment of these people to these centers, because then, again, it's a critical mass issue. If you're a technology developer, you want to be surrounded by other people who have like-minded thinking. So finally, the last minute, the training pipeline, whether India should follow the US or chart its own course, and I'll specifically speak to postdoctoral training. So I don't have any other slides. I'll just talk through this. I mean, basically, India, from the first YIM, where there were hardly any postdocs in India at all, and it was almost impossible to find even an applicant for a YIM from an Indian postdoc institute. The postdoctoral pipeline, relatively has exploded. Undergone enormous change to become, at least starting to become, part of the training system and workforce of India. And I think it's great to have postdocs. Postdocs are wonderful. They add to the environment of the lab. They can train, act as mentors for graduate students. But they are a responsibility. They are a responsibility. They are not just a workforce. And I think what the United States has made a mistake is really not treating them as trainees, but treating them as a workforce. And the US PIs have grown addicted to having, relatively very skilled, cheap labor, which is postdocs, in their laboratories, but not completely really thinking through the whole transition to get these postdocs jobs. So the postdoc training period has grown very long in the US to 5 years or more. US institutions have not trained postdocs, and until recently they have not really provided these postdocs with other skill sets to get jobs in other sectors other than the academic sector. I think these are all lessons that India can learn, and the time to really think about that is now, because now is when almost the first group of postdocs are kind of reaching the end of their training period, and it's a time that I might say India has to think about where these postdocs are going in terms of what jobs are being created, and also what kind of training that they're getting, following them to really see what the job outcomes are for these trainees. So again, I think this is something where following the U.S. may not be, the right model here, and I would just put it to India. India can do better, and now's the time to think of doing just that. So with that, I'll finish, and I think how many minutes? 45 or 40? I can take a couple questions right now. I'm following the time very closely. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Right. No, well, I'll say, first of all, you're absolutely right that, science is international now, and I mean, wherever you are as a scientist, you have to, you think internationally, and I think any individual scientist should be thinking internationally in terms of collaborations or opportunities. But I do think you do have to think of countries as units. The United States is not sending money or limited money, to India. I mean, you, as a country, have a budget that you have to make decisions about where that money is going to be spent and how to spend it wisely. So, while it's nice to think about the global community of science, which is really true, individual countries have to make decisions about how they invest their resources and how to invest them wisely. So in practice, I mean, countries do have to make important decisions, with regard to their values and also, how they, as I said, how they allocate resources. I mean, going back, maybe in that spirit of that comment to what Jitu was saying, though, about, current trends of, not whether science may be under some threat, in terms of how it's perceived and how it's valued and how it's, even the autonomy that science is given. I mean, those, to some extent, that is a global issue right now. I mean, what Jitu pointed out is a global issue. And I think one has to think about that issue in country-specific ways. I mean, U.S. right now, with our politics, has its own complications with science perception. But again, I do think that in many of these cases, we have to think of how we present science, to the world, and how we, to some way, it is the hope for the world. The hope for the world rests, in science. Not only because of what we do, the value of science for thinking about the world as a whole and the world's problems, whether it's disease or climate science. And, the fact that of all professions, I think we are so lucky. We're so lucky to be in science because we are an international profession. Like lawyers or a whole bunch of other professions out there do not think of themselves as international at all. And, the reason why I'm here and taking an interest in India also is because raising the boats of science all over the world are what's going to do good for the world overall. So maybe with that statement, I will pass to Vijay.
I'm not so much worried about how science is perceived in the country and the climate and all that. I mean, I think those are aberrations and we will overcome them with better communication and better networking. I have specific comments on two things you said. One is the postdoctoral experience in the country, and the second is about collaborative networks. The postdoctoral experience in the country, yes, the number of postdocs have increased, but it really suffers from two things. One is good mentorship given to these postdocs, and the second is this perception that if you've done a postdoc in India, you're not going to get a faculty position, or so that's one. And the second thing I want to touch upon is specifically the reagent banks in the collaborative networks. I hope that this meeting can discuss some of that, because each one of us that retires from an institution after spending 25, 30 years leaves a wealth of reagents. And what happens to those after we leave is anybody's guess. So I think we need to start organizing ourselves to set up something like an Indian ad gene, for example. So maybe something like this could be discussed at the meeting.
No, yeah, those are all good points. I'll just take the postdoctoral, issue, right? I mean, we're going to discuss this at the meeting, so there'll be plenty of time for discussion. I do think the two things we've learned about like postdocs in U.S. Yes, absolutely, you cannot count on any lab for good mentoring, and therefore, like institutions have to. Many institutions have programs for graduate students, thesis committees, etc. Institutions have to think about training programs for their postdoctoral population overall. I think that's the message there. The second point is about jobs in India. I'm going to get a lot of hate mail after this statement I'm going to make, but maybe this will be my last DM. But I do think that some leading institutes, universities, leading places in India need to hire Indian postdocs. Because I think that is, you can't have it both ways. That's the thing. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that, we value postdocs, we want a postdoc culture, we see this as fundamental to the future of Indian science. You can't say that and also say we're not going to hire you. So there's a fundamental, a logic disconnect between those statements. So, I think the bottom line is that now's the time to do it, because young people are going to look to see what's happening to the postdocs, and if they see that there is no pipeline for them, they are not going. The next round are not going to be Indian postdocs. They're going to try even harder to get out, because the message will be very clear to them, and that will ruin the one chance that India has, like right now, to develop a complete training pipeline on its own. Maybe. So with that statement, maybe I better leave town.
Sorry, may I just, Ron? I had a little comment to add to the idea of a unified sort of system of science. And not necessarily importing everything that the US model does. I think we have something pretty precious. It's a culture of mutual pride and interdependency. Not a month goes by when there isn't an email from somebody out to their network. I need this antibody, does someone have it? And it's sent. 10 years in the US, I never heard of this. People are just willing to help. And people take pride in each other's work. The very nuclear laboratory system in the US does not allow people to, feel they are part of the work of somebody in the next building. Whereas here, somebody publishes in a good journal, you get email from some remote town somewhere where somebody says, I feel so proud an Indian did this. So that's something we shouldn't lose.
I will comment. I totally agree with you. And that's why I think the collaborative network idea is more of a formalization of something that is already kind of here already, and actually could just be extended, even possibly with certain directed kinds of grants that would also kind of promote more organization around the culture that you're describing, because I agree with you. I think another example of that kind of culture is in some disease organizations. And I think that's another interesting area to model that kind of system and notion around. So there are muscular dystrophy or ALS. Those are examples of funding agencies that actually fund research. But what they do also is they create communities of scientists who are really fundamentally concerned about solving that disease. And that is paramount over other minor concerns like, oh, how do I beat so-and-so to the next publication in X? So I think these disease model organizations have been great examples of where scientists from many places end up sharing knowledge before publication, end up sharing reagents, because it's the same kind of problem. It's a tough problem that they face. There are a limited number of people that are working on it, and they can't waste any time. And I think that similar mentality is a little bit like India. Like, we don't have time to waste. Let's think of ways in which we can really work together and, float as many boats as possible in a constructive, organized way.